We'll start with what is allowance for doubtful debts first. When we sell goods to customers on credit in real life, sometimes things happen and our customers cannot pay what they are owing us. If this happens a few times, we as business owners see a trend and therefore can predict roughly how much of those credit sales might become uncollectible in the future. So we have to set up an account called Allowance for Doubtful Debts to reflect this prediction. Now, if we predict that next year $2,000 will not be collectible, how do we record that in General Journal? The entries will look like this: credit allowance for doubtful debts and debit bad debt expense. The question is why? This is just a prediction and also just an estimation, not a confirmed figure. So why we already recognize it as an expense? The answer is we have to recognize it because it is relevant. It is practically saying to accounting report users that of all credit sales, $2,000 might be uncollectible. That information helps the user to make decisions in the future where they can decide if they will continue their business with that accounts receivable or not. Also, that information faithfully represents the true economic benefit from those credit sales, where part of it, which in this case is $2,000, will not be contributing to the profit. So all in all, we have to recognize it as bad debt expense. Remember, even though the name of the expense is bad debt expense here, but it is not the actual confirmed bad debt. It is just a prediction. Usually when we recognize an expense, we credit cash at bank and we debit bad debt expense. However, in this case, we are not actually paying anything, so we can't really credit cash at bank. Instead, we credit allowance for doubtful debts. This is a contra asset or reverse asset account, which decreases the value of accounts receivable on balance sheet. So on balance sheet, we will show up like this: account receivable under current asset, less allowance for doubtful debts. Okay, so we're clear on how to record or raise the balance of allowance for doubtful debts. Let's get to how to record entries when actual bad debt is confirmed. So we have two scenarios here. Scenario 1, 100% of what the accounts receivable is owing us is uncollectible, meaning that they can't pay us anything, not even 1 cent. Up here you can see that with the prediction, we credit allowance for doubtful debts, and now that the prediction has come true, we have to close it by debit into it. So we have debit allowance for doubtful debts. And since they are no longer our accounts receivable because they won't pay us in the future, we also have to close accounts receivable account, and therefore which initially has a debit balance, and therefore to close it we have to credit it. So we credit accounts receivable, debit GST clearing, and debit allowance for doubtful debts. Looking at these entries here, what do you think of? Correct. So it looks very similar to when accounts receivable pays us, or in other words, when they are no longer owe us anything. This should be us, not use. Okay. So we also credit accounts receivable. We also debit GST clearing. But in this case, because we are not receiving any cash, so we cannot debit into cash at bank, and instead we debit it into allowance for doubtful debts. So you can think about writing off bad debts as the accounts receivable is paying us in the contra asset account instead of in cash at bank. All right. So scenario 2, accounts receivable pays us part of the debt. The rest becomes bad debts. The adjustment from scenario 1 here to scenario 2 is quite simple. Since we are receiving some cash, we debit that much amount that pay us into cash at bank. So in this case, the total accounts receivable, the amount that they are owing us is $2,750. They pay us in cash 825. So the actual amount that they are owing us is 1925, including GST. So we have to divide it into 11 to get the GST, and the rest goes into allowance for doubtful debts. So it's the entries are pretty much the same, except that we add in one more entry for cash at bank, the cash receipts. Now there are two notions that you have to remember. One is for GST clearing, we only apply it on the owing amount. So in here, they only owe us 1750 left, and we charge the GST on that. Do not charge the GST on the whole amount of accounts receivable. And second notion is you have to always make sure that the debit equals credit, because sometimes you might make mistakes and the total of debit side might be greater than the credit or the accounts receivable balance. Okay, so that is that. Next we talk about adjusting new balance for allowance for doubtful debts for the next accounting period. So you have a look at this table here. This table is the one that I copied from the textbook, so you will find it relevant later. Now in this case, we have the balance at the 1st of Jan, which is the first of the year, of $5,000 for allowance for doubtful debts. So basically it is saying that they are predicting that this year you will have $5,000 of bad debts. Now you have debit balance of accounts receivable here, which total up to $3,750. Now these are actual bad debts. So you have the prediction of $5,000, whereas the actual bad debt is $3,750. So therefore, the balance of the allowance of doubtful debts is $5,000 minus the actual bad debts, which is $3,750, equals $1,250. So this is the balance of the allowance of doubtful debts of the year. Now you know that we want the management says, I want the new balance of the allowance for doubtful debts for next year is $4,000. Okay, so we already have the balance of $1,250 this year. In order to have $4,000 at the start of the next year, we have to increase the balance of allowance for doubtful debts by $4,000 minus $1,250 equals $2,750. So that is how much allowance for doubtful debts you have to increase in order to have the new balance for the next year as $4,000. Now the question is, how do we increase the balance of allowance for doubtful debts? You just go back to how to record allowance for doubtful debts. So this is how you increase it by $2,000. So if we want to increase it by $2,750, how do we record it? We do exactly the same, except the figures are different. So debit expense and credit allowance for doubtful debts. So that's what exactly we're doing here. Credit to bad debt expense, $27 and $50. So we total them up. Initially we don't have this one here. So initially we don't have that one. But then when we total them up, this side we have 7,750. And in order for this one to be balanced with this one, we have to add in the balance, which is $4,000 here. And we carried forward that balance to the next year, which is $4,000. Okay, and that's it. That's pretty much it for the allowance for doubtful debts. So remember, you have to know three things. One is how to record the allowance for doubtful debts. Second, how to write off bad debts. And third, how to adjust the new balance for the next year of the allowance for doubtful debts. That's it.